Alright, hello everybody, welcome back. Today is July the 15th, 2024. Today we have a particularly gnarly conjunction of Mars, Uranus, and the fixed star Algol at 26 degrees Taurus. And the moon today is in Scorpio, which is in a opposition more or less to these planets and stars, and the moon itself does not do very well in Scorpio. The moon is said to be in its fall in Scorpio, so this is altogether a fairly gnarly one. And the good news, I suppose, is that Mars will be ingressing away from out of Taurus into Gemini on July 21st, so that's less than a week away. So we've got less than a week of Mars in Taurus, and I guess the obvious thing going on is the since I recorded my last video, there has been an assassination attempt on Donald Trump. I'm sure everybody knows all about this, and I don't need to go into it in very much detail. Now, the thing is that I have in the past made videos about fixed star Algol and transits to Algol. Maybe it's been a while since I did one, but I can put a link in the comments. I'm sure I've done these before, right? And I'm not going to go really into the nitty-gritty of the Algol thing, although it relates to Medusa and the myth of Medusa, where Medusa was killed by Perseus, and then the image of Medusa was used on a shield used by Athena, right? So there's a complicated thing where I'm sure there's a lot of astrologers that are talking about this that are going to go into more in-depth analysis about the Medusa myth and what that whole story is about. There is one of the things that I heard about it, though, which is, I have to admit, I was playing around with ChatGPT, and I tried asking ChatGPT what it thought about the assertion that Medusa was really, like, the story about Perseus killing Medusa was really something about the Greeks conquering some kind of ancient feminine religion from Africa. And according to ChatGPT, this was not substantiated in any way at all. This is just speculation or rumor. But there's this way that, you know, that the way the Greek mythology works is that there are a lot of myths that are actually taken from other cultures, right? The idea that Prometheus actually came from the Caucus, right? The Caucasian mountains, right? And which are more into around where the in between Afghanistan and Russia and in Eastern Europe, the Eurasia, like it's not really exactly where Greece is that this myth came from. It was like a neighboring area, and that they like the story so much, they're like, well, why don't we just incorporate it in and make him one of our gods, right? In the similar way that there's not like the Greek mythology and the Egyptian mythology is exactly the same, but they saw enough of a resemblance between certain deities like Hermes, Thoth, or whatever, that they said, hey, well, what you guys are basically talking about the same thing. Our gods are your gods. Maybe there's a bit of a difference in our stories, but there's this kind of polytheistic way of it not just being a we're the only ones that are right, and our culture has this perspective, but trying to incorporate in deities from other cultures. And at some point I heard that Medusa was an attempt to, there's something, maybe a deity from another culture that was more threatening to the principles or something like that, and they had to be the cultists had to be violently squashed and repressed or something. But I don't know. It's all just speculation. If anybody can, substantiate this or validate this, that's up to them. But nevertheless, one of the books that I have, I picked this book up. Well, I don't know. I've had this for at least a year, but I have this book called Brady's Book of Fixed Stars by Bernadette Brady. And I will just read what she has to say about Algol, although there's quite a bit here about some I don't think it's as the whole thing about the heliacal risings and things like that. We don't have to get into that right now. I'm going to skip to this part. All writers agree that this is the most malefic star in the heavens and causes hangings, death by loss of one's head, and any other foul demonic deed that could befall the human race. So, obviously, right from the beginning, this is a star that's associated with hangings and death by loss of one's head. And I've talked to other astrologers where they've said that this can be, rather than a literal death, this could also be a kind of more metaphorical, in like if somebody is acting kind of crazy or somebody gets really upset, and we say figuratively that a person loses their head. And it's also relating to the beheading of Medusa. Although, this is kind of interesting because what we just saw happen was an assassination attempt where Donald Trump got out with his life, but a bullet grazed his ear, which is really kind of strange because it's like it makes you wonder that if the person shot was just a little bit more accurate, it would have changed everything, right? There's like a hairline difference between him living and dying, but nevertheless, it would have been a head wound, and this is something that the fixed star Algol is associated with, right? I'm going to keep reading here. Algol, the concept. Algol was called Ras Al Ghul by the Arabs, which meant the head of the demon, and they considered this female demon to be the wife of the devil. Ptolemy labeled the star as the brightest one of those in the Gorgon's head. The Chinese called the star Sei, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that, meaning piled up corpses. Pretty gnarly stuff. In Talmudic law, she is the first wife of Adam, Lilith, who left him because she refused to be submissive to his needs. Lilith then fled to paradise and became a demon of the wind. She was considered a curse since she gave sexual pleasure and was the cause of all male wet dreams. Although this is kind of confusing for me because there is multiple uses of Lilith in astrology, which I personally don't really get into, but there's a black moon Lilith, as well as there's also an asteroid named Lilith. So to associate Algol also with Lilith is like there's a lot of potential ways you could draw a Lilith connection without getting into fixed stars. Although, however, one thing that I find interesting about this is that, like in my last video, I was mentioning that because Venus was going to oppose Pluto, you were going to see a lot of things about, the controversy that's been coming up recently about how there's in the United States, there is some political push to use the MAGA ticket to push for illegalizing abortion, and there's certain issues around like abortions, women's reproductive rights, as well as the anger around Donald Trump being outed with his connections to Jeffrey Epstein, which I don't need to go into the details of, but you can understand how the image of the furious, enraged, angry Medusa's head which is used as a shield of Athena. Athena, the goddess who is born not from sexual intercourse, but born straight out of Jupiter's head. A kind of sort of this kind of idea of a kind of like a this kind of Athena is much more kind of detached from sex stuff. Like Athena was not born of sexual reproduction. She's less sociable and more kind of about military strategy, about clear thinking military strategy, and the more passionate, I would guess you would say, vision of femininity being in the form of the severed head of Medusa is nonetheless incorporated, like integrate, like there you have these two different sides of, I guess you would say, goddesses, right? You have almost like contrasting principles, but there's like some way that the Medusa's head becomes the shield of Athena, that it's like integrated into the Athena archetype, that Athena is sort of has a reputation of like having a cool head, not losing her head, having this cool-headed military strategy, whereas Medusa being this sort of like the enraged passions, or like the sort of expression of whatever it would be, all sorts of hatred or disgust or something, that is the horrifying image is used as a protective shield held by Athena, who herself is more cool and detached, you would say, right? But what was I saying? There's some sort of thing about the how when you're doing astrology, sometimes the same archetype repeats itself in different areas, and so you can see something coming up with fixed stars that are also just there in, let's say, a Venus-Pluto opposition. But the fact that, okay, it's a particularly intense time because you've got Venus opposing Pluto at the same time that in Venus's sign Taurus, Mars and Uranus are both conjunct Algol, and at the time of making this video, the moon is in Scorpio, Mars' sign, so it's just all around pretty gnarly right now. Anyways, I'll keep reading this. Eventually led in the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian cultures to the suppression in the male of all sexual pleasure, which then led to the suppression of the sexual woman. Now, I'm not going to comment on this because I'm no expert in things about the myth of Lilith or the era, these kinds of religious things, about how male sexual repression or female sexual repression has to do with the fixed star Algol, or has to do with Medusa, or has to do with Lilith. I'm just reading. This is what Bernadette Brady says. She, being an expert on the fixed stars, who has written this book that I'm using as a reference. Algol thus embodied everything that men feared in the feminine. She is not the mother face of the goddess, but rather the passionate lover or the whore. She is female Kundalini energy. In the words of Barbara Black Koltrov, Eve, destined to be the mother of all those to live and made from Adam's own rib, was not as powerful or primordial as Lilith, whom Adam now meets only at night with nocturnal erections as he lies dreaming. And there is the snare of Lilith's vengeful, murderous rage, of which man must never be more wary. So there's some sort of idea of like, there's some sort of anger or frustration or murderous rage that has to do with the repression of sexuality, which could just also be like the idea of, I've heard this in terms of people talking about war in the term, like if you think about World War II, apparently most of the people in World War II, the soldiers, were in their early 20s, and then there's a sort of part of why there were so many protests around Vietnam was that a lot of the soldiers were even younger than that. They were like 19 years old, right? They were just like kids being sent over to Vietnam. And I've often heard this idea that there's a sort of link between what you'd call Eros and Thanatos, where there's some kind of like drive, the reproductive drive can also be turned into this like destructive force, where you've got people, instead of going out and whatever, enjoying themselves, or being in tune with their desire in that way, basically you've got frustrated desires, and then you've got the frustration and anger that comes from repressed desire being weaponized as a kind of a military force, right? Where you've got, and all of this, I think, goes with this kind of attitude about either like disgust or aversion or repression, where things are seen to be looked down on or seen as dirty or embarrassing or humiliating and shameful. And there's some sort of desire that's thwarted and then frustrated, and then that frustration is then like mechanized to, instead of being a life reproducing force, it becomes a life destroying force. And oftentimes this has to do with like certain things like scapegoating, where you could like scapegoat certain peoples or certain maybe political situations as being the source of the frustration, and then the frustration is taken out in a violent way or whatever. But it's sort of like a kind of, and it's a common thing that you hear about quite a bit, anyways, right? Like usually young people are kind of hormonal, or young teenagers are, they spend their youth, with the follies of youth, right? Like and that's seen as maybe being a kind of a natural thing, but there's a certain way that I also have a book here that I've been reading, a classic, the Mass Psychology of Fascism by Wilhelm Reich, and he talks all about this, how the libidinal forces are basically harnessed by the fascists, and to be used for violent ends, and this has a lot to do with either like sexual repression, or also like he talks about like the defense of the motherland, in the sense of like viewing the immigrant or viewing the refugee as a sexual threat. These people are not just here to undermine your culture. They're like the idea that we have to have a very, be afraid of people that aren't like you, because they are out to have sex with your girlfriends, your sisters, your mothers, and so so people that it's sort of like all this kind of stuff. This I definitely recommend this one. So anyways, I'm going to keep on reading with the Bernadette Brady here. Algol, in other words, is the wild, raw, frightening face of the outraged feminine, which has been labeled as demonic or simply evil. This star seems to contain immense female passion and power. It is the power of the feminine, or potential power of Mother Nature, not to be called evil for being strong. It is a companion star to the nebula Capulus, also in Perseus, which is the male version of this outrage. Albert Einstein had Algol culminating. Now, culminating means conjunct the midheaven. That, to me, I just find talking about the midheaven to be a bit more clear than talking about culminating all the time. But Albert Einstein had Algol culminating with his Jupiter on the day he was born, and is remembered for his great work in unleashing the power of the atom. That power itself is not evil, but when it is expressed itself in the bombings of Japan, then we saw the destructive power of Algol. John F. Kennedy had Mars culminating with Algol in his chart, and was killed by an assassin's bullet in the head, showing us the more literal side of Algol. Now, what is interesting is that I was reading this book perhaps to prepare for making a video about this particular transit prior to Donald Trump's assassination attempt. And so when I read this, I thought, I had the opportunity to make a video perhaps insinuating or predicting this based on the association with JFK. But I thought, this is the thing, is that so much of YouTube success and popularity seems to be associated with a certain kind of sensationalism, right? And I personally, even if I had an opportunity to make some kind of sensationalistic prediction, I think it's just sort of like common sense that it's probably better not to do this. Now, of course, there may be all sorts of other astrologers who may go around making sensationalistic predictions, but I saw the opportunity and I decided not to do it, right? So now I'm doing it after the fact. Now that it's already happened, I don't have to, I'm not going to be as sensationalistic about it. But I did think it was interesting. I will put it in the comments, I suppose. If you actually look at the more closely what's going on with JFK's chart. Also, I don't know I don't think culminating is really, maybe I'm wrong with this whole culminating thing, but in JFK's chart it says his midheaven is in Cancer, not in Taurus, and so he's got, what's interesting first of all is that JFK has Saturn at 27 Cancer, Neptune at 2 Leo. So that's Jupiter conjunct Saturn out of sign by an orb of 5 degrees, right? And at the time of doing this, Jupiter is conjunct Saturn by 10 degrees. So JFK had it out of sign, but he had a tighter conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn. No, sorry, not Jupiter and Saturn. Saturn and Neptune. Neptune at Leo 2, Saturn at Cancer 27, by orb of 5 degrees. And there's something that I was associating this with communism, because similar conjunctions were happening at the time of the Russian Revolution. And the thing about, I have to admit here that maybe I'm confused about what Bernadette Brady means by culminating, because I thought culminating meant conjunct the midheaven. But in the chart that I have for John F. Kennedy, I have him with a Libra ascendant, and I have him with Jupiter, Mercury, and Mars in Taurus. Mars is at 18 degrees, Mercury is at 20 degrees, Jupiter is at 23 degrees Taurus. And what is interesting that I find is that the planet Uranus is in Aquarius at 23 degrees, meaning that John F. Kennedy had Uranus in a perfect square to Jupiter and Taurus, and that both of those are within a 3-degree orb to fixed star Algol. Now, Bernadette Brady says that John F. Kennedy had Mars culminating with Algol on his chart. Now, she is using Mars here probably because Mars is more associated with acts of violence and war and things like that. But there is something remarkable that you can look at this in terms of a kind of archetypal alphabet, and that Mars and Taurus, what does that also remind you of? January 6th, right? Do you remember that January 6th happened right as Mars was making the ingress into Taurus from Aries, right? So there's something going on where Mars in Taurus has been two very pivotal things in the career of Donald Trump so far. The insurrection attempt, where he led an angry mob to take over the White House, as well as Mars and Taurus there for an attempted assassination, right? And this Mars and Taurus was in the natal chart of JFK, right? And also the fact that Uranus was in this perfect square to Algol, to Jupiter. So it's a different dynamic with all these other planets involved. But I thought this was at least interesting and worth pointing out. Now, I have already seen, I was just watching random astrology videos that were being recommended to me, and some other astrologer pointed out, of course, that Donald Trump has Mars in Leo, and that the current conjunction of Uranus, Mars, and Algol in Taurus is squaring his natal Mars placement. And so he's getting, they're basically attributing what happened to that kind of a transit. I'll keep reading here. O.J. Simpson, United States athlete and actor, born at the moment this star was culminating, also shows the heavy side of this star. He was accused of the brutal murder of his wife, and although he was acquitted, will be remembered as having been connected to this crime. Now, interesting also is that O.J. Simpson just passed away recently. Now, I'm not really that prepared for this, but I'm going to look up the O.J. Simpson astrology. I'm just kind of doing it with with minimal preparation, and I'm probably not even going to edit in the charts. You're going to have to click them if you want to look at them, or look them up yourselves. Now, O.J. Simpson. No, this is in more. This is like this. Given this chart, they have the midheaven at 18 degrees Taurus, being not like, you know. So this is where I think when she's saying culminating, she's talking about the midheaven, because if you've got Taurus on the midheaven, then that, you know, O.J. Simpson doesn't have any Taurus placements at all, but the midheaven is an important place in a chart, and especially when you're using fixed stars, what you want to look at is any of the angles, like the ascendant, the descendant, the midheaven, the IC, and what fixed stars are conjunct those angles are going to be very important. Now, this chart gives 18 degrees. That's considerably far away from the 26 that Taurus is, but the people who write the book on fixed stars still use this, right? And so the thing about John F. Kennedy, well, I don't know. Maybe this is Rodden reading a data source from memory. It's possible that somebody else was using a different birth time for JFK that gave him a Taurus midheaven. The chart that I have for JFK has a Cancer midheaven, where Saturn is conjunct the midheaven, not all this Taurus business, right? Saturn in Cancer conjunct the midheaven. But you can see that O.J. Simpson has a Taurus Algol midheaven, or at least approximately anyways. Adolf Hitler had the star setting as his sun was on the nadir, so the force of Algol expressed itself in the latter phase of his life and influenced his very identity as it contracted his sun. Okay, well, just for the sake of looking at the chart here, let's look at it. So this is actually interesting because you have the same, in Adolf Hitler, you have the same rising sign as JFK. You have the Libra rising. This is a Rodden rated AA chart. So, and so Bernadette Brady says, Adolf Hitler had the star setting as his sun was on the nadir. what I see here is I see the sun at 0 degrees Taurus. I thought the nadir was supposed... I guess, is the nadir the descendant, or is the nadir the IC? I thought the nadir was supposed to be the IC. But here you have... What's interesting is that Adolf Hitler has Mars in Taurus, conjunct Venus in Taurus. But this is 16 degrees, right? So here we have Mars conjunct Uranus at 26 degrees, right smack dab on Algol, whereas Adolf Hitler had Mars in Taurus, but not anywhere near... Well, it's a whole decan away from Algol. I wouldn't really count that. But what's also interesting, though, is that Adolf Hitler had Uranus at 19 degrees Libra conjunct the ascendant. So this whole thing about the Uranus-Mars conjunction in Algol, with Algol, is that Adolf Hitler had Uranus in an opposition to Mars and Venus in Taurus, although not quite as kidding off the Algol thing. But here you have an interesting thing where you have these pivotal world leaders of the 20th century from different ends of the political spectrum, both JFK and Adolf Hitler, both with Mars in Taurus, and you've got Donald Trump who has Mars in Leo, but I'm just pointing this up because astrologically it's interesting because you both had the January 6th insurrection attempt and the assassination attempt happening with this Mars in Taurus transit, and the Uranian thing. I mean, I hope Donald Trump isn't the next Adolf Hitler. I really do. But I don't mean to fan the flames of fear and worry. I'm just, this is just what we got. This is what the universe is dealing us up. And I'm a man who has an astrology channel, and I figured I may as well try to, whatever. I mean, how often do you get the opportunity to make a video on a day that has these kinds of transits, right? I mean, it's either make this video now or else tomorrow it'll be separating, and in a week's time Mars will be in Gemini, and it'll all be just looking back on it, right? So I might as well try to talk about it while it's active. And then also they talk about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had his Mercury rising with Algol, so from an early age in his expression, thinking, and therefore his music was filled with the passion and intensity of Algol. She says, Algol in the natal chart. Algol represents a strong, consuming passion that may devour you with anger and rage. If one can contain an unconscious compulsion to take revenge and focus that passion into a more productive outcome, Algol is the most powerful, or is one of the most powerful stars of the sky. Whatever planet it affects in your chart will be charged with strong, intense sexual energy that has the potential to be wonderful, or if repressed, can lead to rage or violence. Algol as the heliacal rising star at birth. I don't know if we need to get into this right now. You get the idea. But this is, I mean, I'm not sure. What's interesting here is that I'm not sure if I am like a total Bernadette Brady supporter. I have to admit that I bought this book because I wanted, there's so much you can do online these days. You can just look up fixed stars, Google it. You get so much information just on the internet for free. I thought it'd be nice to have a book on the fixed stars to use as a reference. I think there may be other books on the fixed stars as well, but I just got this one. It's one of the more popular books on the fixed stars. So this is, and even if there may be certain things that I find might be, like I am having trouble with the way she uses culminating, because in some charts it's clear that culminating means the midheaven, but in other charts it's like, no, this is the 8th house. This isn't culminating, right? Or like, I don't know how but whatever. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of it. It is what it is. But I'm saying and I'm noticing enough here that it's still very relevant. It's still, especially when you just see what has just happened with current events. And before, I don't know. I have to admit, I haven't really been feeling super great since that has happened. I'm not trying to watch too much of the news. I mean, I don't know if I should just read some random bits of Wilhelm Reich in the Mass Psychology of Fascism. I haven't really prepared. Probably should not. I mean, this is pretty good, though. Maybe it will. Okay, this is a fairly, well, whatever. This seems to be. I have to admit, I've not done a lot of preparation, and I'm pretty much just flipping this book to a page at random to read from it, um, because I feel like this sort of goes with the conversation about what Bernadette Brady is trying to push forward about Algol being about repression and the anger or frustration and how that's utilized as a political force. Although I have to admit, I haven't read this whole book yet, and I'm just kind of flipping to a page at random. But this looks good enough for me, so I'm just going to read a bit of this to see what happens. Okay. In contrast to Christian ideology, as we shall see later, fascist ideology separates man's orgastic yearning from the human structure produced under authoritarian patriarchy and relates it to various races. Nordic is equated to bright, majestic, heavenly, asexual, pure, whereas Near Eastern is equated to instinctual, demonic, sexual, ecstatic, orgastic. This explains why Bacoffin's intuitive and romantic investigations were rejected as the theory of that which only appears to be ancient Greek life. In the fascist race theory, the orgasm anxiety of the man subjugated to authority appears in an absolute form, eternalized as the pure and contrasted with the animal-like and orgastic. Thus, what is Greek and what is racial become an emanation of what is pure. What is asexual, while what is racially alien, the Etruscan, is related to what is animal and therefore inferior. In keeping with this line of reasoning, patriarchy is taken as the source of the human history of the Aryans. And there's a quote here from Rosenberg. The first great historically decisive battle between racial values was carried out on Greek soil. A battle decided in favor of the Nordic nature. From this point on, man approaches life from daylight, from life itself, everything which we call Greek culture and our great heritage from antiquity originated from the law of light and of heaven, from the spirit of and nature of the Father. The patriarchal authority. Now we're back to the commentary of Reich. The patriarchal authoritarian sexual order that resulted from the revolutionary processes of latter-day matriarchy, economic independence of the chief's family from the maternal gens, a growing exchange of goods between tribes, development of the means of production, etc., becomes the primary basis of authoritarian ideology by depriving the women, children, and adolescents of their sexual freedom, making a commodity of sex, and placing sexual interests in the service of economic subjugation. From now on, sexuality is indeed distorted. It becomes diabolical and demonic and has to be curbed. In terms of patriarchal demands, the innocent sensuousness of matriarchy appears as the lascivious unchaining of dark powers. The Dionysian becomes sinful yearning, which patriarchal culture can conceive of only as something chaotic and dirty, surrounded by and imbued with human sexual structures that have become distorted and lascivious. Patriarchal man is shackled for the first time in an ideology in which the sexual and dirty, sexual and vulgar or demonic become inseparable associations. And this is primarily what Bernadette Brady is trying to play off in terms of the meaning of what fixed star Algol means, and the idea that the Perseus killing Medusa was this kind of like this idea of this sort of young daylight masculinity being created as something that is in direct opposition to a kind of a dirty, animalistic femininity, which is seen as vulgar and, something that people are averse to, whereas the purity is about purifying yourself from this stuff and rejecting this stuff. And there's a certain anger, frustration that comes out as the head of Medusa, which is worn as a fearful thing on the shield of Athena. Who, Athena, as I remind you, wasn't even created out of sex. She was just pulled straight out of Zeus's head, right? As a kind of an ideal that is completely detached from the animal. It's a heavenly ideal that's completely detached from like the animal life of reproduction, right? And also a feminine ideal that is aligned with the protector of cities, because Athens was named after Athena. The Greeks named their city after a female deity that had to do with military strategy, but herself was not produced by sexual intercourse, but rather just sprung from the head of Zeus, right? So I don't know if there's any point in reading any more of this. Maybe I will, just for the hell of it. Secondarily, however, this evaluation is also rational justification. With the imposition of chastity, women become unchaste under the pressure of their sexual demands. The sexual brutality on the part of the male and the corresponding conception on the part of the female that for her the sexual act is something disgraceful takes the place of the natural orgastic sensuousness. Extramarital sexual intercourse, to be sure, is not done away with anywhere. With the shifting of the valuation and abolition of the institutions that previously protected and sanctioned it in a matriarchal society, it becomes involved in a conflict with official morality and is forced to lead to a clandestine existence, meaning secret, taboo, hidden, right? The exchange in the social attitude towards sexual intercourse also affects the change in the inner experience of sexuality. The conflict that is now created between the natural and sublime morality disturbs the individual's ability to gratify his needs. The feeling of guilt now associated with sexuality cleaves the natural orgastic course of the sexual coalescence and produces a damming up of sexual energy, which later breaks out in various ways. Neurosis, sexual aberrations, the antisocial sexuality become permanent social phenomena. Childhood and adolescent sexuality, which were given a positive value in the original matriarchal work democracy, fall prey to systematic suppression, which differs only in form. As time goes on, this sexuality, which is so distorted, disturbed, brutalized, and prostituted, advocates the very ideology to which it owes its origin. Those who negate sexuality can now justifiably point to it as something brutal and dirty. That this dirty sexuality is not natural sexuality, but merely patriarchal sexuality is simply overlooked. And the sexology of latter-day capitalistic patriarchy is no less affected by this evaluation than the vulgar views it condemns it to complete sterility. Later we shall see how religious mysticism becomes organized center of these evaluations and ideologies. For the present, we must merely bear in mind that religious mysticism denies the sex economic principle altogether and condemns sexuality as a sinful phenomenon of humanity from which only the hereafter can deliver us. Nationalistic fascism, on the other hand, transfers sexual sensuality to the alien race, which is relegated to an inferior status in this way. From now on, the depreciation of the alien race coincides organically with the latter-day patriarchal imperialism. In Christian mythology, God never appears without his counterpart, the devil, as the god of the underworld. And the victory of the divine God over the infernal God becomes the symbol of human elevation. This confrontation is also depicted in Greek mythology by the struggle between orgastic biosexuality and the strivings that demand chastity. To the abstract moralist and the mystifying philosopher, the confrontation appears as the wrestling of the two essences or human ideas, one which may be regarded as vulgar from the outset, while the other is looked upon as the truly human or superhuman. However, and this is also interesting because the superhuman you start to hear a ring of Friedrich Nietzsche, and it's really interesting is that I have to admit that in my own astrology channel that I started reading Nietzsche, but I've been avoiding bringing him up mainly because there's an image of what Nietzsche is like that I want to avoid being associated with. But what I'm starting to realize is that a lot of the image of what Nietzsche is like may be a kind of a myth or a legend rather than actual fact. For example, I believe in one of my videos I may have mentioned this whole thing about Nietzsche and the Turin horse, where Nietzsche broke down at the sight of a horse being beaten in the street. And apparently, this may not have even happened. This is just rumor. It's unsubstantiated, right? And there's all this stuff about how Nietzsche has come to represent a guy who is sexually frustrated, who had no success with women, and that he's become the kind of idol of a bunch of alienated, disempowered, frustrated young white men or something like this. And I'm just trying to avoid those associations. But one of the things that's interesting that I read about Nietzsche is that he was involved in this kind of a maybe almost polyamory. There's this book that I did for one of the book clubs, Creaturely Love. They talk about it in the beginning, where there's a picture where where is it? Nietzsche arranged a photograph of the three of us, in spite of strong objections on the part of Paul Ray, who suffered throughout his life from a pathological aversion to the reproduction of his features. Nietzsche was in a playful mood, not only insisted on the photo, but took a personal hand in the details. For example, the little or far too little cart, and even a touch of kitsch with a spring of lilacs on the whips, etc. And so recalls the original Lou Andreas Salome. So, and it goes, this book starts off with this sort of anecdote about Nietzsche, Lulu, and Paul Ray, if I'm getting his name right. And the idea that Nietzsche was in this weird kind of like three-way relationship with the object of his affections, this Lulu Salome, but the thing is like Nietzsche had this whole idea about the Übermensch, about the superior man as being somehow like superior to the desires of sexual, but nonetheless he putting himself in this kind of frustrating situation where he's going to be in a weird three-way dynamic where none of the people is getting satisfied, and it's kind of frustrating that you've got two guys and one girl and having this sort of libidinal energy that isn't good. But the idea that they were going to take this libidinal energy and instead of just enjoying themselves, enjoying pleasure. They were going to harness their sexual repression or whatever for the sake of trying to achieve a state of being Ubermensch, right? Of being above their they're rising above their human predicament to a state of kind of artistic, being saturated by artistic brilliance, because they're not discharging any of their energy. They're just all this sort of pent up energy is being channeled into their work, kind of thing. And that there's not that Nietzsche was frustrated, but rather that he had some sort of was doing this to himself. Now the thing is, I was just recently making all sorts of mistakes talking about Nietzsche, talking about the Turin horse, so I might not even, maybe I'm getting this wrong too, right? But there's something about there's also, if you take in consideration that Lulu Salome, after this whole weird three-way dynamic, who did she end up with? She ended up with Rilke, right? And Rilke was the guy who wrote the poem about the archaic torso of Apollo, where it's like, it has the famous line, that there is no place where you are not seen, and you must change your life, right? But there's still something in this where, being seen in all the places where you don't want to be seen, there's still some sort of thing about maybe shame, or maybe embarrassment, or maybe fear of ridicule, or maybe the past trauma where you've been wounded, and this paternalistic kind of thing of being that's not the way to do it, you have to do it this way. We're not going to be like this, we're going to be like this, sort of the father complex, the super ego that points you in some direction. But is there a version of that is actually in tune with the truth, right? How much of there's a certain question of our own shame and our own humiliation, how much of that is inflicted into us as a way to control us, to use our own libidinal energies to serve the war machine, and how much of that is actually a moral structure. How much of it, is it, if your own energies are being subverted to go to war, if that's what being a man is about, which, this is the thing, it goes back to Plato, that Plato was what proves a nation is strong is that a nation competes against one nation state goes to war against other nation states, and the ones that are better win, right? And the ones that are the toughest fighters, well, how are you going to get your fighters so tough? Well, you're going to have to humiliate them and turn all their sexual energy into basically killing machines, and they'll go and kill all the other people. And then, because we survived, that means we're the winners. We have the better society, right? And that's basically the basis for Western civilization, right? Which is kind of fucked, I think, And this is something that I don't really... I find people kind of gloss over that about Plato. And I'm not sure if I'm completely on board with Platonism for that reason. Because it seems a bit hawkish to me. Anyways, I don't know. I'm just kind of riffing it here and pulling books off my shelf at random. But I'm almost at an hour now, so I think it's a good place to stop. So I'm just rolling with it, right? This is a pretty gnarly transit, pretty gnarly current events. And I am just doing my thing, offering whatever I have. Hopefully you guys like it. Thanks for watching again. Please like and subscribe. I don't know. Stay safe out there. This Mars-Uranus stuff, like I said, this is the peak of it right now. The conjunction is today. And on July 21st, we got Mars into Gemini, where we're going to have some Mars Jupiter in Gemini action. That should be interesting. But until then, well, whatever. I'll see you for my next video, or you'll see me, I should say. Thanks for watching. Bye.